Speaking about the power of blockchain, please welcome to the stage founding CEO of SGInnovate, Steve Leonard. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. All right, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the power of blockchain, and I know we're in this transition thing here between last session, this session. What I'm going to do is speak about what we see as SGInnovate and why we care about the blockchain, and what I'm going to do is hopefully persuade you that the blockchain is both powerful and important. And I don't know whether there's a lot of blockchain enthusiasts in the room or people that are just curious, but part of my goal for today is not to try and get into lots of technical discussion about the blockchain, but more why we think it's something that we should be really caring about. So let me go ahead and jump into it here. So we do think that it's powerful. And what I'm going to do is use for the moment the example of cryptocurrencies, because that's kind of where attention for the blockchain started. And that's really what people identify with and seem to understand. So I'm going to use it as a little bit of a platform. So I like this idea of some and many and every. So some people made fortunes. And obviously, if you were early in the blockchain understanding and you decided to be in Bitcoin, then you may have done really well. So here's the example that I like to share. If you think that it was about 2010 that there was, for the first time, an opportunity to trade Bitcoin. And it was roughly 39 cents at its peak in 2010. And then at the end of 2017, it hit its current high, which is 19,000. So if you take a look, today it's about 7,500 US, about 10,000 Sing. But the example that I really love in this is that one of the earliest ever commercial activities, where it was a virtual currency to buy a physical good, and some may know this story, was the developer that ended up buying 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin. And if you take a look at what that is now, he transferred 10,000 Bitcoin to another Bitcoin enthusiast in the UK, who went on to use his credit card to buy 2 pizzas to have them delivered to the guy's house. Those 10,000 Bitcoin at their high were worth $190 million. And so and he's been interviewed a bunch of times, and he said, hey, I was just in it for the tech. I didn't really care about the money, but I think it's pretty hard to think about $190 million for 2 pizzas. But there's a lot of people like Tim Draper and others that are fanatical. And you may have seen that Steve Wozniak was just quoted the other day that he hopes that Bitcoin will become a global currency. So there's people that care about this a lot. Then there's regulators, there are banks, and people are nervous. Because it's virtual, things like KYC, or Know Your Customer, and AML, anti-money laundering, are really difficult challenges when you think about some of this in this context, the virtual currency. But the regulators know it's important. So some countries have decided to clamp down, and some countries have decided to adopt let's see how it goes. And Singapore, thankfully, is one of those that's a bit more in the let's see how it goes. Now, ICOs, which are ongoing as a tokenization using blockchain, are also making people nervous because, unfortunately, there's lots of misbehavior and fraud. So the exciting thing is, for sure, it's important. For sure, it's powerful in some of these contexts, but people are still feeling their way, like they do with any of these new technologies. And every corporation is concerned and interested to understand what does it mean to them. How should the corporations be thinking about this thing called blockchain? Will it be a good thing for their business or something that's going to cause a big problem? So we know that it can be powerful. But what we like to do is say, can it also be important? And in this context, I'm going to encourage you to think with me about important, meaning does it help humanity, right? So for those that are interested in can it be important as in is it a cool technology, I'm going to spend more time on the can it be important? Can it solve important problems? So from that perspective, I'm going to take some of these as given for those in the audience that are already aware of some of this technology and interested, the idea of permissioned and permissionless, or to say it differently, private and public. How do we think about permissioned blockchain as something that corporates are very excited about? And because they provide access to people they already know, the idea of authorities and approvals is much easier and more simple. Clearly, you know that the public blockchain is the foundation for cryptocurrency, and that brings with it challenges in terms of consensus. So consensus tends to be a slow process when you take a look at a huge volume of things that have to be validated and added to the blockchain. Speed is an issue, and energy consumption is an issue. So I'm going to take all these things as more or less given, because here's what I'd like to spend some time on. You already know that central entities and normally governments are the holders of data. Now, let's set aside for the moment the more recent phenomenon that technology companies are the holders of data, but for the moment, central entities, normally governments, are the holders of data about all of our lives. And we accept that, and that's important, and it goes back to this idea of trust. And the previous panel talked about how it's important that banks are trusted and hold data, but I'm going to offer a different opinion as well, which is how do we want to think of this idea in the future, this idea of trust and relationships being central or not central. And you probably know that it's difficult to be able to have any type of relationship with some of these official areas around health and public safety and education. All of these things that go into our daily lives are really tough if you don't have a digital identity. So when you think about these things, or an identity of any sort, if you think about these things, this is a really big challenge. And it goes right to the heart of why we think blockchain could be important. So what I'm going to do is ask for a show of hands for those that know and could lay their hands on their original birth certificate in the next 1 hour, if you had to do that. How many people could do that? So if you look around, I don't know, by percentage, 5%, maximum 10%. So there's two things in that question for me. One is original, that you know that you could get your hands on it, and the other one is time. Because depending on life circumstances, you may not be able to say, well, I'm sure if I spend a week looking through all my files, I could find it. So if you had to get that because you had to get somewhere in a hurry, could you do that in an hour? And then if I go for the next question and I say, how many people know from childhood through to where you are in life now, your vaccination immunization record? A few, less than 10 people. I don't. I've moved 16 times during my career, and so I don't know where a lot of things relate to my early life are, but that's an important scenario, right? So I want to raise those two things because who you are and what you have done. Forget about things like education, because you can go back to the university that you went to or whatever you want to do. There's somebody. But when you think about when did you last get the tetanus, when did you last get hepatitis A, these are things that are not easily known. So I want to use that as the foundation, because what I'd like to do is take you through a little bit now. A lot of people don't. A lot of people don't have that luxury. A lot of people don't have that luxury. So when you think about this, depending on whether you read that it's 1 billion people or 2 billion people, and if you go Google some of the data, you'll see that there's wide-ranging examples that there's either 1 billion people in the world with no identity or 2 billion people. So I just decided to take a conservative number and say, let's call it 1.3 billion people. But what we know is that nearly half of those people that don't have an identity are kids, right? So I want to bring you back to how do you know who you are and what's happened for you and with you and to you, and what does that mean for your future in terms of all the services that you would want to have and deserve to have as a citizen of whatever country you're a part of. So this is a big problem, and that number is a problem that I'm trying to approach and say, what does the blockchain mean? Okay, now I think this is an important one because the United Nations has said that they want everybody. If you take a look, the United Nations is roughly 193 countries, and there's roughly 195 countries, and I say roughly because it depends on how 1 or 2 places declare themselves. So essentially, every country in the world has said, we want people to have an identity in the next 11 years, 12 years. All right, now if you remember back to 1.3 to 1.5 billion people don't have one today, and we're saying, we want that to be effectively 0 in the next 12 years. This is what countries around the world have embraced and adopted. It's a really significant challenge. Let me try and illustrate how big the problem is and where there might be an opportunity. So for those that know an initiative called ID 2020, I think it's a super interesting, cool initiative. This is Malawi, so a country in southeastern Africa. Malawi has roughly 90% of their kids vaccinated with DTP, right? Diphtheria, tetanus, polio, which is a really important childhood set of vaccinations. Roughly 90%. 2% of the births in Malawi are registered. So you'd say, well, how is it possible that you have 2% of births registered and yet 90% of kids are vaccinated? So based on interviews with one of the caregivers, which really caught my attention, the doctor was saying, I have a child's arm in my hand, I'm giving them the vaccination, or a series of vaccinations, and yet they go off into the distance and we don't know who they are, when we'll see them again, if ever. So ongoing vaccinations in healthcare is difficult because there's no record of who received what and what's the next thing. But the point is, at that moment, is that a window of opportunity? And then what I do is I'd say, how do we capture that information on the blockchain, right? So to bring it back to blockchain, how do we capture that information in a way that's perpetual and we can keep that, and then those individuals have a way of accessing that data as they go through their lives? What role could the blockchain play in something as important as registration and identity for that person's life? Okay, here's a real example, because I like to try and share this one. So aid tech, and in the spirit of transparency, SGInnovate is an equity investor in aid tech, but I use this as an example because we like what they do. We think it's important. We think it's an important example of blockchain. So when we're talking about blockchain is this and blockchain is that, we're trying to boil it down to what's a real use case and how does it help people? In this particular case, improving the transparency of aid that was from a donor to the recipient. And how do we know that it went from somewhere and to somewhere and ultimately where it went and for what it was used? And how has that gone on to make a difference? And then how can we use some of the information from that to make better decisions when you take that data in aggregate and you understand how it's being applied for antibiotics or for healthcare or for education? So aid tech is doing some of this work right now on the blockchain. And we invested in them because we'd like to be students. We'd like to learn. We'd like to understand how these use cases can make a difference. And we think this is one great one. Obviously, Aadhaar in India, with 1.1 billion, 1.2 billion citizens now registered as a unique ID, is another amazing example of using biometric information. So how do we think of iris scan, thumbprint, ways of validating someone's identity, capturing someone's identity? And before somebody says, well, that sounds Big Brother, and what if it's misused? I would also argue the opposite, which is those things are not without merit, meaning those are good questions. But when we think about it, we know that there are problems today with human trafficking. We know there are problems today with people not receiving the health care, the education, the public safety that they would deserve as human beings. So before we spend a lot of time saying, well, what if the system is misused? I would also encourage us to think about these are problems that we're already experiencing now. So before we become terribly agitated about some potential problem, let's also be honest about the problems that we have now. So I love the example that something that has that much biometric information of over 1 billion people, how could that be thought of in the blockchain? And I'm not the one to talk about that. There's lots of people that are talking about it. Why is that? Because anytime you have that much information, the first response from any entity is, I centralize it, I protect it, I make sure that nobody gets access to it that shouldn't have access to it, and it's in one spot, right? And that's the proverbial, if you know where to go, then you spend a lot of energy going to that one spot. So here's the question that I'd like to try and pose. Today, any entity, a bank, a government, any entity or institution, tries to think first about very sensitive and important information. Let's make sure that it's in this amazing data center. Let's make sure everybody has an ID badge. Let's make sure that we have very big doors on the building. All those are great things. But how do we also think about the fact that maybe one way of thinking about keeping information safe is to do the exact opposite? Do we keep information more safe by centralizing it and constricting access to only a few? Or do we keep information more safe by decentralizing it and making information available to everyone, and I'm not saying in a public information way, there has to be encryption and anonymity, but can we think about this idea that it doesn't automatically follow that putting something in one spot and having only a few people be able to touch it is by definition the most secure way? And so when people become excited about the blockchain, I know there's the cryptocurrency fanatics and the ICO fanatics, and that's also great. But the idea that there are going to be evolutions and iterations in which rethinking models, how do governments and citizens relate to each other? What happens if I'm a citizen of country X and I go to country Y? Am I still able to have that information go with me? Am I the owner of that information? How do I think about my relationship with everybody that's ever interacted with me and that information which represents me and my personal story? So what I'd like to do is leave you with this thought that blockchain is powerful. It's made some people a ton of money. It's certainly made a lot of regulatory environments rethink how they approach these issues. It's certainly this idea of trying to think about a new model, and businesses have to embrace it, for sure. Just like if you said, I don't want to talk about the internet because I don't know where it's going to go, and you said that 20 years ago, that's a big problem. But blockchain will represent something like that. Where it goes, we don't know. But we think it's nonetheless powerful. What I think is more important is that it's going to fundamentally cause people to ask the question, do I keep everything in one spot and only a few trusted people get access to it, or do I distribute it and trust the greater good of the mechanisms which allow us to all keep essentially track of the same information together? So for us, it's where does this lead us from here? We wouldn't pretend to have the answer, but what we'd like to do is be a part of the conversation. And so I always put my own data up. If you're interested in continuing the conversation, we would like to have it be a conversation for the simple reason that we think the more we talk about these things and the more that we debate and the more we challenge each other, that will lead us collectively onto a path that's good for everyone. So think about powerful, but please, today, think about the blockchain as important in terms of people's lives and the greater good for humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.